Northern Manhattan residents and other stakeholders to take action to protect those residents most vulnerable and disproportionately impacted by New York City's housing crisis. The objectives will be identifying the harms that residents will further endure when the eviction moratorium expires, providing members with information on available resources, tools, best practices, and strategies to prevent coronavirus-related evictions, exposing the connections between housing discrimination and the policies and practices that lead to New York City's housing crisis, and then members understanding what level of government is responsible for what as it relates to the housing security, and finally developing a unified vision of what housing should look like in New York City using the Housing as a Human Right framework. So the agenda is going to start with the welcome, which I'm doing currently, and then we're going to move on to a housing and justice presentation. The keynote speaker is going to be Professor Johanna Fernandez of Baruch College. Then we're going to go on to our solutions panel discussion, followed by our policy panel, and then we will have our closing. So the next portion of the agenda is going to be the housing and justice presentation, which is going to be presented by my fellow planning committee members, Gwen Black and Juan Juarez. Thanks.
Thank you, Brittany. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see you this morning. I am Gwen Black, and I am a member of WEAC and currently a member of the Planning Committee. And I would like to share some information about how the explosion of homelessness, the lack of affordable housing in New York City, and how hard we are impacted. As of May 2020, it has been reported that there are 59,308 people who are homeless, and 4,000 of them are sleeping on the streets, subways, and other public spaces. And it's very alarming to learn that there are 13,523 homeless families, in which of 20,044 are children who are homeless. This is outrageous. While traveling in the wee hours of the morning, I personally have witnessed a wide range of people riding and sleeping on the subways. It is alarming to see people from teenagers to seniors homeless and having to sleep in public spaces. I once witnessed a woman sleeping in the lobby of a Chase bank with all of her belongings scattered around her. It was very painful to watch. As you can see, homelessness has affected people, many people, in the past several years. I personally have experienced homelessness and the loss of my apartment on Riverside Drive because of my inability to afford a lawyer at $4,000 at that time. I am still fighting the case, and it has cost me extra money to fight a wrongful eviction. Up until today, as I mentioned, I'm still fighting against the case, and there are many other people who are fighting against their case. No one should have to appear before a judge without a lawyer. Although the city has programs in place to quote unquote assist people, there are many cases where these agencies are very ineffective with helping people keep their apartments. However, they're getting paid public money, these agencies, but there is no transparency on how effective these agencies are doing to fight against evictions. We need more accountability from these city agencies, as I had testified at the public hearing with the Office of Civil Justice, which was newly formed after 2016. Also, there's a lack of affordable housing, lawyers, along with there is racism in the courtrooms. These are contributing factors that have incited the boom of homelessness in New York City. There are many other factors, such as skyrocketing rents and minimal wage growth. And in the last few years, the median income has increased 4%. But there are many people who are making under $25,000 and simply cannot afford the pricey apartments that are being built in our communities. And there are many being shut out of these new apartments. I personally have been on the Housing Connect list for over 3 years. And when I was recently contacted by PS 106 on 146, I was told all of the affordable housing was gone and I didn't qualify for the higher price apartments. Although I have been living in this community for over 10 years, I too have been shut out of these new so-called affordable housing. Lack of proper living arrangements, lack of access to cooking, healthy meals, lack of families being able to live together. Many are forced to live apart when they are evicted from their apartments. And for some, living in old, moldy apartments, such as I have witnessed at 670 Riverside Drive right here in Harlem, and especially affects our seniors, this contributes greatly to mental stress, chronic illness, and ultimately homelessness. And placing people in hotels is not the solution. Out of 700 hotels here in New York City, 139 are housing homeless people. They need access to long-term, safe, and permanent housing. So in closing, as you can see, more is needed to be done to combat the rise in homelessness and the need for more affordable housing and put a stop to these pricey apartments, which many of these developers are getting public funding and support from the government, but many in the community have no access to these apartments. So I want to thank you for hearing my story. And next, I would like to invite Mr. Gores to speak about other issues concerning home ownership and other issues, which all ties with this rise. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Gores, React Planning member, and this morning, today I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about my story, which is transition from public housing into home ownership. Then I'm going to talk about barriers to home ownership for African American and Latinos. And finally, I'm going to talk about the impact of rent cancellation in New York State for mom and pops and private homeowners. So I'm going to start with my story. I want to share my screen.
Are you able to share your screen, Juan?
Okay. But I think it's disabled because I'm not a host, but
I'm gonna make you a host right now, Juan. Give me 2 seconds. I got you. All right, you are good to go, Juan.
okay. Can you guys see my screen? No? Can you see my screen? No?
Did you click
Try
the
it again, Juan.
Huh?
What's
No.
your name?
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Oh, Juan Gores. Yes, yes, yes.
You can see my screen, right?
You're in the balcony.
Barriers to home ownership.
If you're
No?
sharing something, Juan, we can't see it. Can't
Okay.
see it.
Okay. All right.
Well,
You know,
we're gonna have
I'll just go forward.
Okay.
Forward. So basically, my story is a transition from living in public housing to buying a co-op apartment, and it was an experience because what happened was that I've been living in public housing for about 20 years, and I was on the waiting list for 16 years for a co-op, and it finally came through, and it was a very positive experience, and you know that I wish that everyone could transition from living in an apartment or whether it is substandard or regular apartment home ownership. And that's my story in terms of transitioning to home ownership. But now I want to talk about barriers to home ownership for African American and Latino. There are several barriers we encounter in terms of home ownership for low income or minority. One of the first barrier is lack of capital for down payment and closing costs. Uh, oftentimes, oftentimes, Black and Latino lack the ability to accumulate uh, money for a down payment, pay for closing costs, and in terms, one of the instruments for home ownership. Uh, another thing is the lack of access to credit and poor credit history. Oftentimes, lender make it difficult for potential home buyers in low income neighborhood to get a loan. Uh, Many of the home buyers also uh, don't have an established credit, which is important for home ownership. Another aspect is the lack of understanding of the whole process of home ownership. Even even then, this is why you need an attorney to do a real estate transaction in New York State, because the home ownership process is very complex. Even if you do study and go through it, you will miss something. There's a lot of fraud and scam in terms of home ownership. That's why you need an attorney, and the whole process is able to get educated on it. And it's very complex. There's lack of clarity at closing time of the contract. There's also predatory lending, uh, home improvement scam, uh, there's language barriers for Latino people that don't speak English. Okay, so let me move on. There's also
Juan, can you hear me? I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. It's very hard to hear what you're saying.
Oh,
I think you probably have to get close to the mic or something because people are chatting about it also. It's not just me.
okay, I'm sorry.
It sounds like you're mumbling.
I'm sorry. Is it
All
better
right.
now? Can you hear
Yes,
me
that's
better?
better.
Yes.
It's better.
It's better?
Thank
Okay, thank you for that. There's also regulatory burden. Basically, there's a lot of regulation that involve in zoning when you purchase a home, and unless also the developer uh, un- add in other regulation and barriers to homeowning, such as planning sites code and administration and processing complex regulation. In addition, there's also not in my backyard syndrome, where some people are excluded from selection from housing, and also it goes back to redlining, which is illegal, but it's still practiced in terms of home ownership. Uh, Finally, there's also the continued housing discrimination. Uh, there's a continued pattern of discrimination where people are denied suitable housing in terms of the living environment based on race, color, origin, national origin, religion, gender, family status, disability. There's also there's also the continuous discrimination pattern in terms of marginalized due to economic, financial status. Which is, the financial status is not really legal per se, but how it's used, it is presented in a illegal way. So the takeaway for the homeownership, takeaway for the homeownership is that it is challenging. There's a continued discrimination pattern, inequality, and adding to it is gentrification and denial of state resources. I'm going to move on into the mom and pops. Negative impact of the mom and pop. So basically, in April, Speaker Corey Johnson introduced a bill. Hold on one second. Introduced a bill called 1912 to ease economic downfall due to COVID-19. COVID-19. Okay, one second.
This is not cool. It's not cool.
So the moratorium policy has a dichotomy built in because it's not all landlords are created equal. Not all landlords are created, and most of the real estate property are not owned by large corporations. For example, there are 28.8 million private entities that own real estate, according to 2015 American Housing Survey, while 22.7% rental units are owned by individuals. Moving forward, mom and pop store and individual own 22.7 million of housing, which are duplex and private homes. Mom and pops store homeowners face unpaid utility bill, damaged units, a breach of leases, and financial burden when the tenant leave the apartment and they break their lease. Roughly 20 million Americans are still unemployed and struggle to pay their bill, food, and rent. In some, COVID-19 continued to devastate poor and people of color with housing, health, and financial inequality. Disparity in home ownership for Blacks and Latinos has existed not only since the New Deal, but since the late 60s. But also, it is prevalent in today's real estate market. Discrimination presents itself in many forms, such as it is evident in the Black Lives Matter movement and other marginalized groups. That's my the end.
Thank you so much, Gwen. But before you introduce our keynote speakers, I just wanted to hear a little bit from some of you all. So if you don't mind, I'm just gonna launch a quick poll really quickly. It's just gonna ask you if you, you know what, scratch that, we're gonna keep us moving. Can you introduce our new, our keynote speaker, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Johanna Fernandez. She is a professor of history at the college and also an author of the Young Lord.
Thanks, Ron. Is there anything you'd like to add, Gwen, to the introduction?
Yes, thank you, Juan, for your presentation about home ownership. That's very essential that we begin to allow people to buy their homes, which really adds to the economy and really made people a part of the community. I will have the pleasure this morning of introducing our keynote speaker, Ms. Johanna Fernandez. Ms. Fernandez is a native New Yorker. She received her PhD in history from Columbia University and a BA in Literature and American Civilization from Brown University. Professor Fernandez teaches 20th century U.S. history, the history of social movements, the political economy of American cities, and African American history. She has previously taught at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Yay, that's my hometown. In Pennsylvania, and Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and is most recently the recipient of a Fulbright Scholars Grant to the Middle East and North Africa that will take her to Jordan, that took her to Jordan in the spring of 2011, where she taught graduate courses in American history. Welcome, Professor Johanna Fernandez.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Thank you so very much for inviting me to this conversation. And I think that my remarks will offer some context for the remarks made on homelessness and private home ownership by your previous speakers. I also want to let folks know that history is power, because everything that we have to contend with today in our city, and I am a native New Yorker. I grew up in the Bronx during the crack epidemic, and my parents still live in the Bronx. I live on Riverside Drive, and I'm trying to figure out how the hell I'm going to stay in New York, because rent is outrageously expensive. It's unaffordable. And so many of us and our people are being driven out. And I'm a professor, so I cannot imagine what other people are experiencing in this city who are part of the working class, essential workers. So this is really an issue that affects so many of us and brings us together. But history is critical to understanding where we are today. And I want to encourage you to pick up a book that I just published this February on the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords. The book is called The Young Lords, A Radical History. And it addresses some of the issues around housing that we're grappling with today. So I was asked to talk about the current housing crisis in 10 minutes. So bear with me. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to keep to that time, but I'm going to try. So what are the origins of the current housing crisis? I think we have to understand that the current housing crisis didn't start today. It's been around forever, although it might be more severe today. The current housing crisis is structural in nature. What does that mean? That means that the crisis is produced by the very economic organization of our society. We know that in the United States, most properties are held in private hands. And also the creation of housing is a for-profit venture. That's what it means when you hear, oh, housing is a commodity. That means that essentially housing and the availability of housing, the creation of housing, is created by people and corporations, large corporations, especially in cities that are driven by the profit motive. Why is this the case? Because this is essentially the logic of our system. All goods and all services produced in our society are under the control of the owners of private property. And the production of all goods and services is organized around this logic, the profit motive. And even the most basic of human needs, what are they? And we know what they are increasingly in this COVID-19 moment. What are the most basic human needs? Housing, food, but also medical care are produced all under this logic. private property. So in the cities, the current developments, there are current developments that have made the housing crisis a lot more acute. And someone made reference to this, your first speaker who spoke about homelessness. And I want to just offer a little more specificity. Over the last 20 years, the average monthly rent for an apartment in New York City has gone up 40%. So our rents have gone up 40% generally across the city. But during the same period, the wages of the city's workers, but also of the professional class, has not kept up with the cost of living. So our wages have only increased by 15%, but our rents have increased by 40%. That's going to mean that some people are not going to be able to make rent, and they are going to be evicted because the system is unforgiving. If you can't pay your rent, you're out. At the same time that there has been a stagnation in wages and an increase in cost of living and rent prices, there has been a massive disinvestment in public housing, but also in all other public services. Public housing, we know, has been allowed to fall into disrepair. Why? Because the for-profit logic of our system has gone unchallenged. So the current New York City budget spends less than 4% of the monies that come in public housing. That's very, very small percentage of the budget of New York is spent on housing and available housing and affordable housing. And part of what we need to do is say that housing is a human right, and we need our taxes to go to making it possible for us to live in the city. Let me give you an example of the crisis, and this is something that I referenced in a previous talk at which some of you were present. Since 2013, there have been 25 million applications for affordable housing in New York City. And you know how many housing units are available? 40,000. 40,000 units are available, but 25 million applications have been put in since 2013. That gives you a sense of the need. And we know that over a third of NYCHA units have been semi-privatized right now. So that gives you a sense that even though there is a massive need, units that have been that have fallen under the public domain, that are owned by the city, are now being privatized because the logic of capitalism and the for-profit motive has gone unchallenged. Okay, and now I want to, and we need to fight that. I think we need a movement that says that we are losing ground. The people who built the city are being displaced by gentrification, and the city, but also the state, has to prioritize affordable housing. It needs to build affordable housing, and the housing has to be kept out of private hands. Because if you have housing in private hands, mostly that's going to mean that people are going to be displaced. Why? Because landlords usually want to get people in their housing units who can pay the highest possible rent. And that's going to be people who are middle class, upper middle class, high paid professionals who can pay these extravagantly high rents, which is mean that landlords are going to find any excuse mostly to displace us. So the housing crisis that we currently are seeing affects Black and brown people disproportionately. Why? Because of structural racism. We live in a country in which people of color live in the cities in rental units, and most white people live in the suburbs in private homes. How did this happen? This process begins in the 1950s. Before the 1950s, you should know, most Americans, regardless of race, lived either in the cities or in rural areas. But beginning in the 1950s, private residential construction of homes reaches an all-time high in the United States. And these homes are built in the suburbs. So it was in the 1950s that the suburbs emerged as a thing in American society. And by the 1960s, single household homes that are privately owned outnumber urban and rural dwellings. Also, beginning in the 1960s, it is more expensive to rent an apartment than to own a home. And what's happening is that people of color are shut out completely from home ownership in the suburbs because of racism, because they do not have access to the mortgages and mortgage loans that are being subsidized by the government, because the government and banks work together to literally not even look at applications coming from areas in the cities where people of color live. You probably know that Levittown, which was built after World War II in Long Island, is the embodiment of this transformation of America into a suburban country. Suburbia emerges in the 1950s because housing and suburban housing and private home ownership is the new frontier of American capitalism. It is fueling spending on consumer goods, TVs, home appliances, and cars. That is the linchpin of the American economy in the 1950s, which is the golden age of American capitalism. How does this happen? Because it takes a lot to move. And people say, and psychologists, that moving is comparable to death and weddings in terms of the level of stress. So if that's the case, how is it that you're going to move the majority of Americans from the cities where they live to the suburbs so quickly in less than a decade? Well, the government subsidized programs that helped white Americans, working class white Americans and white middle class people buy homes. The American government helped restructure the mortgage along a 30-year period with only a small 10% down, and it subsidized home ownership for white Americans. And it did this hugely through the GI Bill. The problem is that people of color were excluded from this process because of racism, essentially, because it was believed that if people of color moved into the suburbs or gained home ownership, even in the city, the price of real estate was going to go down. So what happens as a result of suburbanization? This mass transfer of working class white people and middle class white people into the suburbs. They were previously living in the cities. This led to a decline in the city's tax base. So the population of the city actually goes down, and the people who are left behind in the city are mostly very poor and working class people of color. The population is smaller, and so the tax base goes down, which means that the cities are going to become poorer. There's going to be less money in the city to invest in important social needs like public housing and healthcare available to all. What else happens? This movement of so many people to the suburbs fuels deindustrialization. The fact that the engines of employment, factories, start moving out of the cities, companies, and into the suburbs. So what happens in the city is not only that the tax base is getting smaller, but the jobs, the factory jobs, are leaving the city, moving to the suburbs and then to the south. They're looking for cheaper production costs. So for the first time, the cities become predominantly Black and Latino, and poverty becomes synonymous with the people of color. There's where the racism come in. Oh, what's the problem with the cities? Oh, they're populated by people of color. What we don't ever hear is that at the time when cities become populated by people of color, there's a massive disinvestment and jobs literally leave the cities to the suburbs, and housing goes to hell in a handbasket. So what are the consequences of suburbanization? It made America more segregated by race and class, which is why there's such a disconnect with so many Americans about police brutality, because essentially the cities were creating poverty and unemployment, chronic unemployment, and its housing was falling apart. And what are you going to do when you cannot meet the needs of the people of the city? You have to police them. You have to hammer them with the hammer of the state, the violent hammer of the state. You need to police them, which is why cities are policed a lot more than suburbs. And you need to put them in prison. So a significant number of our people were imprisoned because we were creating poverty that the system was not addressing. As of the 1990s, approximately 90% of suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations of less than 1%. And so we live in a society in which white Americans, mostly working class and middle class, regardless of what they might be experiencing today, were helped to acquire private homes. And private home ownership historically, since the 1950s in America, has been a way to acquire some kind of safety in terms of savings and wealth, because it is cheaper to own a home than to rent an apartment. People of color were excluded through a series of laws from that process. So what is the answer? Again, the government subsidized mortgages in the suburbs, segregated areas. And in fact, it legislated, the government, segregation in public housing. So I'm going to end in a minute. What is the answer? The question is, what is the answer? And how is it that we even have NYCHA? Because NYCHA is public housing, and there are a series of public housing projects in New York, but also in other cities. What is very important for you to understand is that those units were gotten through fierce struggles on the ground by people of the city demanding that city government make good on the promise of democracy by providing the people of the city decency and dignity in housing. There is a crisis of mold and lead poisoning in our city. The only way that historically that has been solved in a significant way is through militant protest in the streets that has shamed the city, and strategies that has shamed the city into addressing the lead poisoning problem, which is not only in the walls of our buildings, but also in the water that we're drinking. Because in the 1990s, because there was a disinvestment in the public good, the engineers who were hired to check that our water was pure, they were let go, because the city didn't think that the public good, or wasn't pressured enough to fund the public good. The reason why we have fire escapes today was because in an early period in the late 19th century and early 20th century, immigrants from Ireland and Italy, they took to the streets to demand proper ventilation and safety conditions in our buildings. In tenement buildings where people burnt up alive, because the conditions were so unsafe. So all of these fire escapes that are so characteristically New York are the product of a fierce struggle on the ground in which working class people, the immigrants of that city, said, we're not going to go down this way. The fact is that private home ownership makes zero sense because costs for heating an individual unit are extremely high. And I mean, we know what it's like. There are some Bronx people who own homes, and you know, they spent the entire time they have to relax, fixing the house, figuring out the heat, fixing this, that, and the third. Your entire life revolves around this. Everywhere else in the world has public housing that's communal and that's affordable, except for the United States, when in fact, in the United States, because we are the wealthiest society humanity has seen, we can actually afford that. So I want to offer some perspective that the need is so large in terms of housing. There's so many homeless people in the city. We already have the solution. There are plenty of housing units that house hundreds of people that are empty, abandoned, or that are standing empty because the private owners don't rent it out to people of color and to working class people because they are waiting for someone else to rent those units at a profit. What we need to say is that this is our city. We were in the city when everyone had abandoned it in the 1980s during the crack epidemic. And we need the city to either raise our wages such that we can afford $3,000 rents, or we need housing that's public, affordable, and decent. What we need to do is shift the terms of debate and do what the union movement did in the 1930s. The union movement in the 1930s, which is responsible for the massive unionization of Americans, which now is down, they were like, oh, you know what we need to do? We need to link the notion of American freedom with economic equality in the streets. We need to shift the terms of debate, and we do that by taking to the streets and engaging in militant action, in strikes. Let me give you an example of what that looks like, and I'm going to end right now. Police brutality has been a thing in our community since God was a boy. But no one paid attention. No one pays attention. In the 1950s, people were being killed by the police. In the 60s, people were being killed by police. In the 30s, people were being killed by... This has been the struggle that has never gotten any attention. Americans don't want to deal with it. Only if you're affected do you take to the streets, and then you're isolated. The media doesn't pay attention. It took the Black Panther Party in the 1960s arming themselves against the police to protect the community in Oakland for the media to pay any attention. Today, it took people rioting in Ferguson and burning down the Minneapolis fire department for the media to pay attention. Unfortunately, when it comes to people of color, Black and brown people, the media only pays attention when we get angry and say, nah, we're not going to go down this way. We need to do that with housing, because what's coming is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic! We are about to be evicted. You think landlords are going to be like, oh no, I feel sorry for you. No, historically, landlords have been the most heartless owners of capital in this country and in the history of humanity. You think it's going to change right now? So unless we take action immediately, we are going to see suffering unlike anything we've seen in modern American history. So we need to we need to really think strategically about what we're going to do. I'll tell you what the Young Lords did in the 1960s that got real reforms. They took over a hospital to amplify the horrific conditions under which Puerto Ricans and Black Americans were getting care. They sat in at the housing office of the city, like literally sat in, we're not leaving until you give us answers. And they sat in at the office of the Department of Health. Literally, they collaborated with all kinds of people, with doctors, with nurses, and with hospital workers to say, our community is dying. It's dying because of lead poisoning. And lead poisoning is attached to the walls of our dilapidated buildings. Our children are eating the lead paint and they are dying or becoming permanently brain damaged. And because of this militancy, but also a strategy and messaging and putting forth demands, the Journal of Public Health credited the Young Lords in 1974 and their militancy and activism with the passage of lead poisoning legislation in New York and the formation of the Bureau of Lead Poisoning. There had been a lot of people involved in the conversation, but no one had taken radical action. And radical, by the way, is a bad word in American society, but radical means addressing the root causes of social problem. I will end for real by saying this. For real, that's it. Native Americans didn't have a concept of private property. To Native Americans, either we all live and we all get to eat, or none of us get to eat. I think we need to go, and Native Americans and Africans and First Peoples, I think we need to go back to the logic of those communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fernandez. Why don't we just clap, show your clapping in the screen. Thank you, show your appreciation by clapping in your screen, and let Professor Fernandez see that we appreciated that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. One of the things that Professor Fernandez talked about was not only giving us a context for what the problem of housing and how it's situated in a particular context, but she was also able to tell us about some solutions. And here today, a panel of amazing activists and advocates around housing issues. And they're going to have an opportunity to share with you some critical pathways to solutions to some of these problems that they've been organizing and working on. We Act for Environmental Justice has been a member of the Just Housing for All Coalition, and we are really thankful for the organizing and strength of that coalition that has really won some amazing victories that you'll hear about in a second. And we chose to enter that coalition because of the many ways in which housing is impacting our many members, many of you who are on the screen here. We've heard from our members that lead is an issue. We've heard from our members that mold is an issue. And We Act has also taken to working on those very issues directly, both at the city and state level. We most recently were responsible for co-leading a coalition with folks from Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation around making sure that for those who have diagnosed medical and respiratory illnesses, that they can actually make sure that their landlords are no longer scraping and painting. We secured Local Law 55, better known as Asthma-Free Homes Act. And even though the mayor didn't sign it into law, we can talk about that at another point in time. It is the law of the land, and we want to make sure that you all know about it. If you have a medically diagnosed respiratory illness and you are not hearing from your landlord and you live in a multifamily unit building, your landlord is required to ask whether or not you have respiratory illness, medically diagnosed, and to then make sure when you complain about mold that it's removed in a proper prescribed way, not just by scraping and painting it. What I want to do is turn to our panelists. We have an amazing group of panelists who are going to share with you their work today. To Neighbors, who's going to talk about the Housing Justice for All campaign that I just, not Tenants and Neighbors, sorry, yes, tenants and neighbors, sorry. Ali Fishgren. Ali
Okay,
is
I will.
the tenant organizer
I'll
at
contact
Tenants and
myself.
Neighbors. And I'm going to ask Ali to speak first about Tenants and Neighbors and the Housing Justice for All campaign. Ali?
Yes, hi, I'm just, let me just go to presentation mode. Okay, I hope you can see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, did I exit okay. So, okay, I'll stay here. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you to Professor Fernandez for that really incredible speech. So my name is Ali Fishgrund, and I'm a tenant organizer with Tenants and Neighbors, and I also mainly work in East Harlem, but we are on the steering committee of Housing Justice for All, which is the largest statewide housing coalition in New York. So I'm going to talk today about Cancel Rent and Reclaim Our Homes, which are the current efforts of the coalition. And I also want to note that Met Council, from which we will hear afterwards, is a member organization of Housing Justice for All. So, okay, great. So we have been working towards a New York Homes Guarantee, which means that every New Yorker has the right to a safe, affordable, and accessible home. We fight for tenants' rights, an end to homelessness, and meaningful investment in public and social housing. So right now, to provide some context, the New York State Legislature is reconvening at the end of this month, and currently 1.4 million New Yorkers are behind on their rent and are facing displacement as eviction courts reopen. And we'll be hearing more about courts afterwards. There are currently 3 bills that we are working to get passed that are before the state legislature that would help solve this crisis and help New Yorkers recover from COVID-19. So I know we already went over this a bit, but housing justice is racial justice, and currently 84% of homeless New Yorkers identify as Black or Latinx, and over 100 people in shelters have died from COVID-19. Additionally, 1 in 5 Black women report being evicted at some point during their lifetime. And in the last 4 months, 51% of Black households report having missed a month of rent, compared with 6% of white households. So the 3 bills that we are trying to pass include the first, which is canceling rent and mortgages and providing relief to mom and pop and nonprofit landlords. The second is strengthening and extending the eviction moratorium. And the third is supporting unhoused people with the Housing Access Voucher Program. And I'm now going to speak a bit more about each of these bills. So the first is the Cancel Rent bill, which would cancel rent universally from March 7th for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis plus an additional 90 days. It would also create a small landlord hardship fund for small landlords, nonprofit landlords, and public housing authorities to make up for lost income due to their lost rent. But in order to opt into this fund, there are a few terms that landlords must abide by, which include opening their books to prove hardship, freezing their rent at pre-COVID-19 levels for 5 years, and abiding by good cause eviction, which gives unregulated tenants more rights, which they currently do not have, because currently if you live in a market rate apartment, your landlord can just decide not to renew your lease for no reason other than wanting to increase the rent for the next tenant. The second bill is the eviction moratorium, and it would prohibit eviction for commercial and residential tenants for the duration of the state of emergency plus an additional year after this state of emergency ends. And it would stop landlords from filing cases against renters. It also would prohibit courts from issuing a judgment of possession, which is a way that landlords are able to evict tenants by taking their apartments. And it would prohibit the foreclosure of any property for the covered period. This would prevent a mass eviction crisis that in turn would lead to a spike in COVIDs and force us back into a shutdown. The third bill is the Housing Access Voucher Program. This would give homeless New Yorkers an immediate pathway out of dangerous shelters, off of the streets, and out of temporary hotel rooms during this global pandemic by providing them with rent support. It is similar to Section 8, and it would be administered by the state. This program would prioritize low-income households in shelters, three-quarter homes, couch surfers, etc., as well as families ineligible for Section 8. So our plan is to continue building our base and bringing more people into the movement. We are working very hard to lobby the three bills to get passed and demand that our allies in the legislature take action. Now is a very critical period, as most of you know, and we are also coordinating mass actions, which include eviction blockades that emphasize the urgency of the moment. So, I apologize, it's a bit cut off, but there are a bunch of ways to help support the work. On August 10th, which is a couple of days from now, there will be an action outside of Manhattan Housing Court at 9 a.m. And then on August 20th, there will be an action targeting REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, for profiting off of evictions. Be outside of their office, and you can contact this email, Cia Weaver, if you would like more information. In addition, we will be having an action on August 23rd in Northern Manhattan. And if you would like information, you can reach out to Andrea, who will be speaking after I do. And we really encourage all of you to call your elected officials and ask them to support our campaign, and specifically to co-sponsor the three bills we're working to get passed. And there is a really wonderful tool. If you go to bit.ly/evictionfree New York, it is a calling tool. So you just put in a bit of information, including your address, and that will connect you directly to the numbers of your elected officials. And finally, we are still collecting stories of those who have been affected, whose housing has been affected by the COVID crisis. And there is a link here, it's cut off, it's housingjusticeforall.org/story map, where you can upload a story and choose to remain anonymous and to explain what's been happening. And we already have tons of stories, so if you're interested, I encourage you to check out that link. So that's it for my presentation. And I guess Andrea from Met Council will be speaking now.
Thank you, Allie.
Okay, I will.
Yes, and before she does, Allie, I just want to thank you so much. And I also want to recognize, a former WEAC staffer, Yolande Kador, is back at Tenants and Neighbors. And so I want to give a shout out to Yolande. She's on the phone this morning. Many of you may remember Yolande as our organizing director from many years ago. Thank you so much to Yolande. I hope that Cordell Clear is joining.
Thank you, Cecil, as well.
Ready for me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Allie and Cecil. So before going a bit more into our strategy of how we're gonna win, I wanted to make sure everyone knew what was happening, because a lot's happened in housing and it's been very unclear. And to start off, right now we have an eviction moratorium in New York. We have an eviction moratorium not because Governor Cuomo has decided that was a good idea, though he's getting a lot of credit for it. It's actually the chief judges which have decided we have an eviction moratorium. Cuomo simply said they're extending the time that landlords have to sue in the future to make it legal for the chief judges to put in the eviction moratorium. That lasts until September 4th. So there's no evictions happening in New York until at least September 4th. Your landlord cannot evict you without going to court. It's really important that spread that word, because there's been a lot of reports on how that people are getting evicted, what can happen to you if you're not paying rent. No one can change your locks. Your landlord can't turn off your utilities to try and get you out. That's all considered an illegal eviction. And it's actually taken very seriously by the city. And it's also true for the rest of the state. So it's really important to know that we've been fighting for these eviction moratoriums to be extended, and that's why they've been extended. Governor Cuomo did not side in his graciousness that maybe we need to stop what's happening, that tenants can't pay rent. He doesn't care. He has been pushed since the beginning of the pandemic to put forward an eviction moratorium to actually try and stop this wave of evictions that we're about to see. We know about a quarter of New Yorkers did not pay rent, have not been able to pay rent since the start of this eviction. Every month, that's what comes up, is people aren't paying rent. And now with the end of the pandemic unemployment, that's gonna be even more people who are using that money to pay rent. And no one should ever have to choose between having to figure out how to get enough food and to pay rent. The choice should never have to be rent. And that's unfortunately what people are doing. That they've been using the pandemic unemployment to pay rent, and relying on mutual aid programs, city programs, and food banks. And now that the pandemic unemployment's ended, a lot of people are just left out in the cold. Well, I guess it's really hot, so left out in the summer heat. And we need a society that actually values that people need to stay home, and we need to let them stay home, right? In all the conversation on how we can actually flatten the curve of COVID, the most important thing is keeping people home. Because when people get evicted, that's not keeping people home. In fact, that's worsening the problem, because people will end up doubling and tripling up, and that just spreads the virus. And so if we are actually committed to ending COVID, we need the COVID relief package that Ali just went over. People need to know that they can stay home and know that it's okay not to work and that they don't need to travel around because rent will be dealt with. In all the conversations we have with elected officials about what to do about rent, the first thing they go to is, what are we going to do for the landlords? Not how are we going to keep people in their home? How are we going to stop that tragedy, that anxiety that the professor talked about? How are we going to make sure that we can keep people safe in New York? But how are we going to make sure landlords make profit? And it's really important that we interrupt this idea, right? We can do better and we can do bigger. And we can keep people in their homes, stop the virus, and exist, right? The program Ali talks about in Cancel Rent actually does have money for landlords, right? Especially small landlords, the people we want to be able to stay in New York. Not the big corporations that have bought up the city, and particularly our focus on Northern Manhattan, now that the rezoning is back on, right? And the current program, the rent relief program that I believe is being talked about in a little bit, was a disaster. It was 3 weeks, and it was only 3 weeks because tenant groups fought for an extra week. It was less than $100 million, not nearly enough for the number of people who applied, and left out huge portions of people. And we actually need a program that includes people. We need to know that anyone affected by COVID doesn't have to worry about rent. That's not the first thing on our minds during a pandemic. And that healthcare and housing are integrally linked. Just as healthcare, housing, and environmental justice are linked. And so we actually, as the professor was talking about, the only way we get these things is by pushing our government, by going out on the streets, by putting up signs in our windows if we can't go out, making sure that everybody knows what needs to happen. Because No one's going to cancel rent. No one's going to do anything about rent without truly being pushed on it. We've gone through 5 months, 5 rent days under quarantine with the government barely doing anything. And so I really encourage you to join us on August 20th in front of Revenue's office at 4 p.m. to push our government to do what's needed to see the power of tenants, to call your elected officials to make sure that they know what bills need to be passed. And if you aren't paying rent, join our rent strike. There's a statewide rent strike going on where we have buildings and individuals who can't pay rent and actually saying we're on rent strike because of that, which I know is a bit of a new concept, not the traditional rent strike, but it's also really important to be part of it. To say that if you can't pay rent because you've lost your job, because you had to stay home, because you had the virus, because you have family members who are vulnerable and you have to stay home, all that is staying home and not paying rent is part of a political thing that needs to be changed. And so we need to reclaim the shame of not paying rent as a political purpose and let our elected officials know and let our landlords know that real things need to change before we can't pay rent. And so it's really important that we talk with our neighbors, just as we're talking to our neighbors about if they can get food, talk to their neighbors about paying rent, and that we actually attack the source of our problems. Right? We have 150 billionaires in New York City. They're not going anywhere. Jeff Bezos just bought a new apartment, right? He's not paying taxes right now in New York. We need to tax the rich. We need to tax the 150 billionaires who aren't going anywhere despite what Cuomo was worried about so that we can actually have places to live. We need to tax pied-à-terres. We need to tax those second and third homes that cost over $5 million to help us stay in our homes. There is no reason why we have billionaires in New York who are making more and more money every day during this pandemic, while we know that our neighbors are about to be evicted. This eviction crisis is not just bad for public health. It's bad for our neighborhoods, it's bad for our communities, and will be a disaster. We have 92,000 homeless people in New York City, in New York State. We are headed towards 100,000. In a very short time. And that number will just continue to grow unless we have dramatic changes. And we see this COVID package as the way to do that. And that includes cancel rent, eviction-free New York, and house the homeless. And so we're really excited to have We Act join us, and hopefully I'll see you all on the street.
Thank you, Anne. And now we're going to turn to our next panelist from Right to the City. Right to
Money
the City.
with power.
Right to the City.
Always have, always will.
2007. A unified response to and a call to halt the displacement of low-income people are marginalized LGBT communities, historic urban neighborhoods. I want to thank Paige for joining us. And Paige, if you're speaking, Paige, you're on mute.
Thanks, Cecil. I couldn't really hear you. You were going in and out, but I think it's my turn to speak now. Hi, everyone. My name is...
Yes, I'm sorry. I just want to remind everybody who is on the line, if you're not talking, please put yourself on mute. There's a lot of background information going on, so please put yourself on mute.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Hi, again. My name is Paige, and I work at Right to the City Alliance. Met Council is actually also a member of ours, and several organizations that are part of the Alliance for Housing Justice that Ali spoke about are also members of Right to the City and Homes for All. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a little presentation to help me remember what I need to say. So yes, Right to the City emerged in 2007 as a unified response to gentrification and a call to halt the displacement of low-income people, people of color, marginalized LGBTQ communities, and youths of color from their historic urban neighborhoods. We are a national alliance of grassroots organizations that are working for land and housing justice, principally. In 2013, we launched a national translocal campaign called Homes for All to win housing as a human right. We see housing as a fundamental human right that should be guaranteed to all people. So our member organizations across the country have plugged into the network of Homes for All to be able to fortify their own local campaigns, but also to grow a national movement of renters. In response to COVID-19, we launched a sort of new phase of the Homes for All campaign, which we were calling Beyond Recovery. We call it Beyond Recovery because when the pandemic is over, we don't want to go back to normal, right? Where people still couldn't afford their rents, when there was still massive displacement of low-income communities of color, right? We want to actually push ourselves to envision a different world, a different reality in which housing is seen as a human right, and everybody, regardless of income, is able to have a safe, dignified roof over their head. So we have 4 principal demands in the Beyond Recovery campaign. The first one is we want a future free from debt. We're calling for an immediate cancellation of rent, mortgages, and utility payments. We have these eviction moratoriums, which is wonderful and is keeping people in their homes right now. However, lots of those moratoriums are expiring now, and there was no rent cancellation or mortgage cancellation during the moratoriums. So effectively, people have just been racking up new debts, right? And so that is what we want to avoid. If you don't have $1,000 to pay rent in March, how are you going to have $4,000 to pay rent in April or in July, right? So we're calling for a future free from debts. Our next demand is we want a future with safe, dignified, and cage-free shelter, sanctuary, and homes for all. We know that permanent refuge and moratorium on evictions, foreclosures, raids, and sweeps is going to help us curb the violence, right? We know that turning vacant units into safe homes, and we know by releasing people from cages, whether they're held by ICE or in our city jails, that is going to decrease the spread of COVID, right? We're seeing an explosion of the virus in prisons and jails and in ICE detention centers. Our next demand is we want a future where utilities vital to our personal and collective health are guaranteed, right? So we don't want anybody losing their utilities during this pandemic. So we want to prohibit utility shutoffs, rate increases, and restore service to all households. And we want a future where our work is valued and protected. We're calling for a guarantee of unemployment, sick time, and paid leave, as well as healthcare, safety, and protections for workers, and a living wage for all. So these demands are meant to address the root of the issue, right? That housing is a commodity, that is something that has to be bought and sold, and it's not seen as a basic human need and a human right. The other part of our Beyond Recovery campaign is the next phase. Since we're seeing that there wasn't actually a full cancellation of rent and mortgage, we're seeing this impending wave of evictions threatening low-income communities and people of color. So we're launching a training series in September called Rooted and Ready, Eviction Defense for the Renter Nation, with the goals of creating content and curriculum that organizers, members of organizations, and impacted renters can prepare to push back against the logic of evictions, right? It doesn't make any sense to evict people in the middle of a pandemic when we know that housing is the one way that keeps people and communities safe. We want to share tools, tactics, and tips that organizers, members of organizations, and impacted renters can use in real time to stop evictions and care for ourselves and our communities. We're going to be lifting up current actions to stop evictions. We want to inspire organizers to take action in their own communities. And we want to demonstrate the ways in which our culture and our own resiliency practices can be used as a defense weapon against evictions. So I wanted to share a story of one of our member organizations out in Minneapolis, because I think this story really highlights the importance of tenant organizing and tenant unity, but also a vision of a world in which housing is not a commodity and that all people deserve permanent, affordable, and safe and dignified housing. United Renters for Justice out in Minneapolis has a collective of tenants who had been fighting against a horrible slumlord for over a year. This landlord, Steve Friends, was not making repairs. He was harassing the tenants. He was attempting to illegally evict a community of mostly Black and brown and immigrant families in this complex. The tenants were living in horrible conditions for years, including mold and with rodents and lack of heat, right? And so the tenants organized, and through their fight, they were able to form a union, and they were able to defend against evictions. The landlord attempted to evict them several times. Nobody was evicted in the end, and they raised enough money and came to an arrangement where they're able to purchase the property themselves, and now they run it as a co-op. So this case, it just really goes to show that if we organize tenant unions, if we organize in our communities against displacement, against evictions, also if we have a vision of, you know what, we deserve not only to rent in peace, but we deserve to make decisions that directly impact how we live in our communities, then we can effectively decommodify land and housing, which is what these tenants did, and provide long-term sustainable housing for the future. These tenants are organizing not only their housing as a collective and as a cooperative, but they're also organizing a childcare cooperative inside of their cooperative. They're organizing to cook collectively and buy food collectively together. They have gardens now. And this means that for generations, this community is going to be able to stay and build and deepen their roots together, and effectively change the way that housing works in their community. So I share that because it's been really inspiring me and giving me some idea of what a future can look like when housing and land is not for sale, is not a commodity. And then I'll just close with our Homes for All strategy to win. I wanted to share this because this is our vision of how we get from an unjust housing system in which we are living now to a just housing system that we all deserve to live in, right? As many speakers have already pointed out, we are dealing with homelessness, we're dealing with mass evictions, we're dealing with gentrification. We see that wealth and power is concentrated with corporate landlords. We see the private control of the for-profit housing system, and we see skyrocketing rents. right? Currently. We think by growing our people power, by organizing collective and escalated actions, by changing the story around housing and evictions, by stopping the harm with rent control and eviction protections, by building new models of land and housing, and by taking back our local governments, we can actually move to a just housing system in which homes are for people, not for profit. Communities actually control the homes and land. People have power over their resources and decisions. Our children and our neighbors live in peace, and we have affordable, dignified, and permanent homes for all. And that's it for me.
So Paige, thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. I just want to thank all of our speakers for those wonderful presentations. This is a picture of some of what the advocacy community is fighting for in terms of solutions. Now what I want to do is turn to our members and those who are online with us today. And if you would, just chat up some questions for our speakers in the chat, and then we can start asking those questions as well. While I do that, I also want to just acknowledge one of our other colleagues, Cordell Clear, has joined us today. And Cordell has been a fighter for lead poisoning. She helped found and launch the New York City Coalition to End Lead Poisoning. And Peggy Shepard, our co-founder, and I remember organizing with Cordell way back in the 90s to make sure that housing was safe from lead in New York City. So just want to thank Cordell Clear for all of her hard work. I'm looking for questions in the chat. Chat us up some questions. I know there was one question from Janet before, and I'm going to put this to you all as the panel, and if you don't have an answer for it, that's okay, but we'll find an answer for our member who's joined us. So Janet asked, what kinds of services do we have in Northern Manhattan to support Black youth fighting homelessness? That was one of the topics that we talked about today. And do any of you have responses for Janet in terms of the question of what kinds of services do we have in Northern Manhattan to support Black youth fighting homelessness? Paige or Ali, do either of you have any leads on that?
Unfortunately, not too familiar.
Okay. Janet, thanks. Janet, we'll get you an answer for that. One thing I would say is if you know someone in that situation, certainly try to reach out to 311. There is obviously the Department for Youth in the city's administrative system, and so they may have some direct answers for that, but have no fear, we will make sure and get some answers for you around that as well. We'll try to get that hopefully before we have to leave. Ali, did you want to say something? Okay, gotcha. All right, any more questions? Any questions for our speakers? I'm surprised, WEAC audience, where are my questions? I don't see them.
Oh, it looks like we have a question from Gwen.
Okay, great. Gwen.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you, and wonderful information. Is it possible to get links to some of the information that was presented? I've been photographing some of the chat with links, but particularly I think it was housing, well, but all of the presentations had great information. Will we have access to any of it?
We'll make sure and get copies of the presentations from the presenters and distribute those as we always do to our folks. So we'll thank you for that question, Gwen.
Great, thank you.
All right. Chat us up, folks. Question, how can we require transparency from HPD as a supervising agency and nonprofits involved with housing? So that question came from Annie. Annie asked the question once again, how can we get transparency from HPD as a supervising agency and the nonprofits involved with housing? Any thoughts on that, folks?
It's a great question. I do work a lot navigating HPD. I would say applying pressure to them especially, you know, I'm a tenant organizer. I believe that working with your neighbors and identifying what it is you need from HPD, but sometimes that your building might not be enough. But I think I'm curious if you want to reach out to me, and I'm here to discuss more kind of what it is you want from HPD, but I know it's difficult. Yeah, I would say reach out. I'd say organize your building. I'm sorry. Yes.
Ali, put your email or phone number in the chat, and then we'll make sure to capture that. So I'm going to take this one last question and then move us on. We have a question from David McKinnon. How can I get someone to take care of the mold in my house? So I'll answer that very quickly, David. First off, if you have a medically diagnosed respiratory illness, you can make sure that your landlord takes care of the mold, not just by scraping and painting, but by following the protocol that the city has laid out. This is the campaign that we along with Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation, fought for and successfully won, along with our members and many other organizations across the city, to make sure that this law was put on the books. That law does apply if you are in multifamily, privately owned, landlord-operated housing in the city. There's also a mold protocol that NYCHA is supposed to be following under a consent order, and that, if you live in NYCHA, that's another way. Obviously, it's not working as effectively as it should be, and that is something that we all need to be organizing around. We act as a Healthy Homes campaign, and we will be kicking off stuff around focusing on NYCHA, and you will hear more about that to come. So if you are having problems with your landlord taking care of it, report them to 311 and specifically ask for local law 55 guidance. You can call 311 and ask specifically for local law guidance, local law 55 guidance, if you have a medically diagnosed respiratory illness. Okay, I am supposed to be stopping now. What other movements are being supported? What other movements are supporting this fair housing agenda? Black Lives Matter. So this is the question. What other movements are supporting this housing agenda? How to get more political power and connections to other movements. So Paige, do you want to take a shot at that fairly quickly?
Sure, yeah. So I'll just say that Right to the City Alliance, we're actually a member of It Takes Roots, which is a national alliance of alliances that work in different sectors of social justice. So the other alliance members are the Climate Justice Alliance, which obviously is working to end climate catastrophe. The Indigenous Environmental Network, which is working to support the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous communities across the country, the continent, and the world. And Global Grassroots Justice Alliance, which works with working class communities of color to push back against militarism and imperialism of the United States empire. And so we're working together to bring grassroots communities of color, working class communities together who are impacted by all of these different systems, right? To build political power from the bottom up to be able to influence legislation at the local, state, and federal level. So that's one united front effort. Right to the City is also a member of the Rising Majority, which is a multiracial national political formation that was seeded by the Movement for Black Lives. So in all of these spaces, what we're trying to figure out is how to converge all of the different work that folks are doing in different issue areas to be able to build a people's political vehicle that can contest for power.
So we're going to end there. Thank you very much. I also want to, on that note of building movements and working collaboratively, I want to lift up two others. There's the Environmental Justice Forum, which is focused on issues nationally as well from an environmental justice perspective. So look them up. as well as the National Black Environmental Justice Network, really standing up around some of the issues around health and housing for sure. So there's a lot of cross-movement work going on. I want to thank our panelist, Paige Coombe. Thank you so much for the work at Right to the City. I want to thank also Ali Fishman, our tenant organizer from New York State, with New York State Tenants and Neighbors. Really appreciate you. Andrea Shapiro had to leave, but we want to thank her as well from Met Council on Housing. I want to thank all of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Ron for our next panel as we take us on into some policy prescriptions that are being discussed as well. Thank you. Marquise?
Yep.
Are we ready? Okay.
Can you see me? Yep. Is this thing on? Hey. Good morning, everybody. How are you? My name is Ron, and I am from the community here. I grew up in this area, 152nd and Broadway. Went to school here. Elementary school, junior high, college, City College in New York. And I want to speak to the New York State Rent and Cancellation Act, because we're going to have Robert Jackson come and speak to us. Senator Robert Jackson has taken on difficult fights on behalf of New Yorkers and never backed down. In his first elected position as school board president, where he launched the campaign for fiscal equity school funding lawsuit, he walked 150 miles to Albany to highlight that case and won a court judgment that awarded $16 billion for New York City public schools. In his 12 years on the city council, where he sponsored the Small Business Job Survival Act and fought for justice and equality. And now as a state senator championing public education, workers' rights, climate justice, gun safety, and more, he knows how to get things done and has a record to prove it. Growing up in Northern Manhattan with 8 brothers and sisters, times were tough. As a student at PS 186, he never dreamed that one day he would be a New York State Senator. It was possible through hard work, perseverance, and the help of good people in the community. Teachers like his track coach at Benjamin Franklin High School, Irwin Goldberg. And he was also at my high school, Irwin Goldberg, John F. Kennedy High School. And Mr. Goldberg is a revered track coach. And he always played an important role. Mr. Goldberg pointed him in the right direction, making sure he went to college. And that has made all the difference. That's why Senator Jackson has fought so hard to knock down barriers and to make sure every child receives the best education possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Jackson. How are you, Mr. Jackson?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of WEAC's membership meeting. And I've been on the call for about 10-15, listening to Johanna Fernandez and all the other panelists. And let me just say that even though I'm directly involved from a legislative point of view and has been involved from a on the grounds point of view, it's always good to hear other people involved in the struggle and about cases that they're working on, and constantly helping us as legislators to refocus about what we're doing and how we're doing it. So like a photographer, you're always taking pictures and one angle is not good enough. So you go to other angles and then you refocus, and depending on the light and everything else, in order to get the best pictures possible. In this struggle, we have to try to use everything that we have in order to make sure that everyone has, as I said earlier, during the pandemic, food to eat and a roof over your head and health insurance. Those are the 3 major things that you need to survive: food, housing, and healthcare. Obviously, but you need to be able to make sure that from a societal point of view, there are jobs and training for everyone to get the type of training and development they need so that they can be part of the solution with respects to resolving matters as far as having the income to afford housing, having the knowledge to have a good job, all of the things that are necessary for us to stay healthy and grow as a people that are struggling to support their families. So as Ronald indicated, I grew up in New York City and family of 9 on welfare, and it's took its toll on all of us. But Erwin Goldberg was our track coach, and he was not only well known at Benjamin Franklin High School, where I went and graduated, but at John F. Kennedy High School, to the point where so many of the Black and brown runners and people at both places, we honor Erwin Goldberg for helping hundreds of young people to go on and go to college. In fact, we honored him no more than 8 months ago at his 92nd birthday here in Washington Heights. So those are the type of individuals that we need overall, and in order to help us grow and develop. And I hope that I am trying to do that as a state senator, being involved with programs for interns in my office, where we give them the type of training and understanding about the issues and concerns that impact our people. And then they use that in the development for their future development overall. And the last thing I always say to them, always give back to the community from which you come, which is very important. But what I am, besides all of the stuff that was discussed and explained, I was going to put in the chat a question that I have. So, and I asked this question out loud. So as a state senator, what could I do to help move the movement, to help move people to own their own home? Because when I run into a lot of people and I talk to them and they say they live in Washington Heights or Inwood or Harlem, I ask them, well, where do you live? Oh, I live in Harlem. Where in Harlem? I live on 148th Street. What, between where and where? I want the specific address, because one of the things I try to do is determine whether or not I actually represent them where they live. So that's why I ask those questions.
Can you break down the Rent and Cancellation Act for us?
I'm sorry, say that again, brother.
Give us an overview of the New York State Rent and Cancellation Act.
I think that it was already discussed, but the bottom line is under Julius Salazar's bill, which I'm a prime co-sponsor on it, the Rent Cancellation Act, basically from the time that the pandemic was announced, which was announced by our governor in March, beginning of March, up until he determined that the pandemic is over in New York State. But beyond that time where he cancels it, 90 days later, the rent should be canceled, and that's just suspended, where no one has an obligation to pay that rent. But obviously, the issue has not really been discussed and thoroughly in the state Senate. It's in the Codes Committee right now. And obviously, as you know, and most people know, that there's a process from a legislative point of view. You have the Assembly, 150 members, and 107 of those members are Democrats. And you have the Senate, 63, in which 40 are Democrats. The bottom line is both the Assembly and Senate have to come together on that bill in unity like that. So it's the same bill in the Assembly and Senate, and then send it to the governor to sign it into law. And obviously, if you follow the governor, the bottom line is that he's not willing to go in the direction that we are talking about. We are talking about, besides this particular bill, we're talking about being able to tax even a little bit more the 119 billionaires and millionaires in New York State, just by a little bit more. So I think the top tax bracket for billionaires and people that are earning over 100 million is like, I think 8.3%. And so we want to increase them, 3 percentage points to 11.3, and no one would suffer. They would not suffer as a result of that. And that could bring in billions of dollars in order to help us that are struggling to survive, as far as not only housing, but as far as education and as far as food and all of the things that we need to survive. And so that's all we're doing, is trying to ask those. But quite frankly, you know, when it comes to that bill and other bills, you know, we people don't know, but we look at, well, do we have enough to pass it? The answer is yes, we have enough to pass it in the Senate. We have enough to pass it in the Assembly, but will the governor sign it into law, or will the governor veto it? And from a process point of view, if the governor vetoes it, then we have enough in the Senate and the Assembly to override the governor's veto and turn it into law. The answer is yes in the Assembly, because you need 2/3, and no in the Senate, because we only have 40 members. We need a minimum of 42. So what we're looking at, when I say we, the Senate overall, because I can tell you I'm a senator, so I know we have 40 members. We want to bring them all back in next January. So November's election is very important. And overall, the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee has identified 11 of 10 of our members are marginal members, meaning that their district could flip back to Republican. That we don't want, because if they flip back, it's going to be more difficult for us to pass any bill, not only the bills as far as a law or regulation, but bills as far as moving forward and trying to tax the wealthiest New Yorkers a little bit more. So understanding those dynamics from a legislative point of view, we want to make sure that the 40 that we have, even though some people may disagree with some of the 40 as to who they are, or maybe they didn't vote for this or vote for that. But from a holistic point of view, we have to bring that 40 back and increase by 2, 3, 4, or 5 more. And that's what we're attempting to do, so that when we move on these bills, and as you may have heard, the Senate Majority Leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, the first woman ever in this New York State Senate to be elected as the Majority Leader of the State Senate, and who happens to be a Black woman who grew up in the projects. You hear me?
Yeah, Senator.
That's extremely important. But then Carl Heastie, the Speaker, who's in the Bronx, they have come together over 10 days ago. 1 second, Charles, let me just finish this sentence. Come together to say that they are willing, in order to move forward in increasing taxes for the wealthiest New Yorkers. And that's the first time that they've come in unity to say that. And that's a great thing. So that basically opens the door for us moving forward at a certain point in time during this legislative process.
Yeah, we're running out of time here, but we want to bring it.
I'm finished at the moment.
Miss Johanna Fernandez, Dr. Johanna Fernandez.
What are your thoughts on the bill?
What are your thoughts on this
Yes,
bill?
my thoughts, well, I'm struggling here. I'm struggling here because I agree that part of what we need to do is tax the billionaire class just a tiny percentage. In fact, we know that if we tax Wall Street like 1%, we can solve this problem overnight, no problem. The question is, how are we going to win that argument in the public sphere? Because ultimately what we need to do is shift the terms of debate, and in so doing, reconfigure the values of our city and of our state. How are we going to do that? I think that historically, the way that we shift consciousness and we pressure politicians to do the right thing is by flexing our muscle, by creating a crisis in society that if the politicians don't solve, there's going to be hell to pay. And the question is, how can we engage the Senator Robert Jackson in this conversation? You know, why don't we have a very publicly amplified conversation in the Senate where we present this to the country and to the city, where we present these arguments? And in fact, part of what we need to do is amplify the voices of those who are hardest hit. So we want to create a crisis of legitimacy, deepen the crisis of legitimacy in our government, and we want to take it to the Senate and to the governor. We can start by organizing a hearing, public, in the Senate, where we bring in the most affected people to tell their stories briefly from We Act. But because part of what the problem is that the New York Times is not talking about this. The Daily News is not talking about this. No one is really putting this before the public in an unequivocal way. Everything is being drowned out by a million other things. So Sir Robert Jackson, I share a lot with you because I went to Manhattan Center. Manhattan Center is the high school that was housed in the old Benjamin Franklin.
I know.
I went
Senator.
To the call.
But hold on, let me just finish. But that hearing needs to be paired with a strategic militant action on the ground that's going to change the terms of debate. We could help you if you perhaps host a hearing in which you bring us to talk about the issues. We act, but then We Act and the other folks who are involved on the ground, we need to devise a strategy that is going to do for housing what Black Lives Matter has done for the fight against police brutality.
Yes. What do you think about that, Senator Jackson?
I think it's all doable. It's just the timing is the question from an organizing point of view. And I think that the panelists on the previous panel that spoke, they talked about on August 10th at 9 a.m. in front of the courthouse. That's raising pressure. On August 20th in front of Rebney at 4 p.m. And then August 23rd, the march in Northern Manhattan. All of that is bringing pressure on the system or the elected public officials, in which some people refer to as politicians. That puts pressure on the system to move in the direction that the populace want. And that's what happened with the raising the revenue off the more than 1% of the richest New Yorkers, where the two leaders have come together and said, yes, they want to consider that. And so I would say absolutely, everything that brings pressure, and I've given the example, you put your tea kettle on in the morning and you turn it on and then you go about your business, but it will tell you when it's ready. And so we have to be ready to make that move. And right now, from an organizing point of view, I don't know if we're ready, quite frankly, but it's going to take all of us working together to make it happen. So I'm in it to win it. I am not afraid, and I'm not here. Let me just say this to anyone who may call me a politician. I'm not a politician, and I don't like when you call me a politician. I'm an elected public official, and if you don't like my representation or anyone's representation, then I demand you to vote us out. That's what happened with this previous primary within the Senate and the Assembly, which is a good thing, because democracy has spoken and the people of those districts have determined who they want to represent. And that's a good thing. That's clearly democracy in action. And that's what I'm about.
Should we go back to the New Deal and bring those ideas back?
Ideas are already there. I just think we have to organize around implementing. That's why I wrote down those specific dates that were given, the August 10th, 20th, and 23rd, because I'm going to look at my schedule and see if I can lock those in and be there. That's part of the pressure, making sure that besides all of these things, that the populace is there and renters are there to get as many elected public officials there as possible also, to show that they are with us in this movement and they will stand with us down where things are. Just like I stood with and spent the night overnight in front of Jeff Bezos' home on the sidewalk on 25th Street and 5th Avenue. It was on a 24-hour fast and we marched to the governor's office.
Oh, very good, very good.
I'm not concerned about action. Let me just say that.
We have a question from Anthony.
Come on with the question.
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for being here. I have a question. Why not in terms of the rent and mortgage cancellation bill, why not simply bring it up to a vote and dare the governor to veto it? Because in that way, at least you'll have it on record that he, that he opposed the measure, something that would be, publicly outrageous. That's one thing. So why not have it on record if he vetoes it? The second thing is it possible to just have the law enforcement stand down and not enforce evictions, not toss people out? Is that an idea or solution?
Well, it would not be law enforcement, it would be the courts.
But someone has to physically remove you to take your possessions out of the home. Is that a solution? But first, the question about Governor Cuomo. Dare him to veto the bill.
Easier said than done. Let me just say that to you. So you have to have the willingness of both leaders to move both conferences in the Assembly and Senate in that direction. And so you have people that have a responsibility of counting the votes. You have to be able to know you have the votes to move the legislation. Even though I say to you in the Senate, we do not have enough votes to override the governor's veto. But understanding one thing, overriding veto is one thing. Having the votes to pass legislation is the primary thing that we have to have. And so I don't know whether or not we have enough votes. I would think that we do, but I am not sure. But I would rather have the votes and move it, as I said to you before, where then the legislation goes to the governor for signing into law rather than veto it. So if he vetoes it, then clearly everyone can point their finger at the governor that he's responsible. So I think that we will be looking at that. But I say to you, from a strategic point of view, one of the most primary things that the Senate is looking to make sure that happens is that we bring back 40 and increase to 40. That's
Great.
extremely important.
I want to thank everyone for participating. And it's been a great session. Thank you, Dr. Johanna Fernandez.
Wait, can I ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question too.
Can I ask a question too?
Oh,
right. I'm gonna. Okay. So
Yes.
but I'm gonna.
I have a question too.
Who's asking the question?
Carlton Borough.
Let me start with you.
Elder on the phone. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, you have.
We act as 5-10 people talking.
I am going to mute
Bringing some accountability to the politicians that we.
Okay.
I'm sorry. If you're asking me a question, whoa, time out. Cecil, please. There were 5 or 10 people that were chatting, and so I need to hear it. Somebody going to ask me a question.
Right.
Need to hear them. So
right, that's right. Senator Jackson, my name is Marquis.
Yeah.
Can everyone else please mute your phone then, if you don't mind?
Okay, everyone's being asked to mute.
We are closing it. I'm going to allow for 2 questions. We're going to run over just a little bit, but I want to make sure that we get to questions. So Professor Fernandez, you had one question you wanted to raise, and then we'll get some of them numbers.
Yeah, Marquis, take the 4 people that identified themselves. Take them all.
Okay, I'm gonna, if you, so the first person I have is Carlton Borough.
Thank you. The private housing finance law, the state Senate and the Assembly needs to take a good look at the private housing finance law, because HPD is running wild with corruption. They favor private development. I know for a fact we're suffering as a result of a lack of oversight. And it's all being done because the private housing finance law has allows HPD to be the supervising agency in setting up these HDFCs, and they don't follow the law at all. They don't even follow their own protocol, because it allows for easy access to God knows how much money. Say, my building, they allegedly spent $6 million, but the results of spending that money doesn't show in the work. So how long can the city afford to allow this agency to abscond with billions and billions of dollars and simultaneously destroy the possibility of preserving affordable housing? And as citizens of New York, we all need to engage in.
Carlton, let me respond to your question. So
Yeah.
obviously, the private finance housing law, if we want to change that, then let's come up with a proposed bill to change it. But obviously, you're talking about HDFCs. I think you live on St. Nicholas Avenue. Is that
Yes,
correct?
I do.
In the
Yes.
same building that Al Taylor lives in. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
And now, one of the things I say to people overall, and when I was a member of the city council, and I used to quickly, and I'm just going to take this 30 seconds. When I used to meet with people in the HDFC in their living room, and I tell them, I feel like kicking you in your butt because you're not doing what you have to do to make sure that you don't lose this house, this home, because all of you are shareholders, and if you lose it, you're going to be renters for the rest of your life because you're not earning the type of income for you to move wherever you want. So making sure that we follow all of the protocols and laws, and also tenants, making sure that whatever contractor comes in, the leaders of your HDFC has to make sure that they know what they're doing. If not, then they basically do what they need to do. So if you want to change the law, let's work on changing the law, and I'll be glad to work with you on that. Are you a member of the HDFC Citywide Coalition?
No.
Okay. No. There's the HDFC City Coalition that is there to fight and protect for all of the HDFCs. You should talk to Michael at 136th Street and Broadway, and
I know Michael.
April Tyler, who's on Community Board 9, Sylvia Tyler, they have the HDFC co-op right across from City College. So the coalition is there to work on behalf of the HDFC shareholders.
Thank you. We have a question from Anthony Santiago. Mr. Santiago.
Hello, Ms. Santiago.
Tony, I'm sorry, Tony Santiago. Tony Santiago.
Oh, Tony.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't have a question.
Okay.
Oh, I thought you had.
No.
All right. So what I'm gonna do? I don't see any other hands raised. Am I missing anyone? Going once.
Yes, you're missing me.
There you go. You have the mic.
Yes, thank you. I'm Queen Mother Dr. Blakely, and I've been in this building at 477 West 142nd Street, which the senator would tell you. He's correct. He comes into our home. I'm at the state, and I have seen him just lately. I'm at the state of being put out during the virus because of predatory lending and mortgage fraud. How will you all mobilize me as an elder who's been homesteading and with sweat equity, and these predatory folks that are putting the elders and disabled out of our community? How would you mobilize around me? Because I am a fighter, and I will fight until the day I die, because it's wrong what they're doing to our community. And thank God I was able to see it close up, and I'm fighting alone. How will you come and fight with Queen Mother Blakely, okay, who's been a humanitarian for 50 years, getting $1 a year, leaving a convent in Harlem, and did not get my due with Sister Act. I created Sister Act, not Whoopi Goldberg, and never got a dime. And again, I created this building 40 years ago that was abandoned in Harlem. HPD and all the rest had nothing to do. What do we do? How do you rally around me as an elder who's almost 80 years old, fighting for you, not for myself?
Thank you, Queen. Thank you, Queen Dr. Blakely. We got the message. So, Jackson, can you answer that question? If you have the opportunity to.
I wish I had a magic solution. I don't. But I do think when she was talking, and I've known Dr. Blakely for a while, And when I was in the city council, I represented where she lives at. But when she was talking, I just thought about, obviously she needs a type of legal help that can evaluate all of the situation and represent her and her shareholders and people in her building. And I just thought of the West Harlem Local Development Corp because they have a legal fund. They have money if in fact she should apply to West Harlem Local Development for a grant in order to provide legal services in that respect. I attempted to, when I was a city council many years ago, was to work with other elected officials to pool their money together. In the city council, it's easier to pool the money than at the state level, in order to have a office where you would have an attorney and a paralegal and an administrator in order to handle housing cases that are in court. But she needs a legal team, and unless someone volunteer, but the West Harlem Local Development Corporation should apply.
The money from the West Harlem Local Development Corporation was actually for legal services for folks in Community District 9, was actually put into resources from Manhattan Legal Services. So we can talk, I think it's a good idea, and we should try to reach out to them to see if we can help grandmother around those issues. I just wanted to input that as a former board member of the West Harlem Local Development Corporation.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for participating. I see we still have 86 people. I'm gonna close us out very quickly. So first and foremost, again, thank you for joining us. We are always trying to improve these meetings and make them better. So today, after this meeting, you will be receiving an evaluation form, and I ask that you please complete it. We are always want to make sure that we're providing the relevant information and setting up these meetings that are tailored to your needs. So please complete the survey that I sent out. Secondly, last month we released a extreme heat survey. We are trying to collect 200 surveys from our members. We are almost at the finish line. I will ask you to please go out and complete that survey. My coworker Sonu has just put it into the chat box. Moving on, I want to give some thank yous. First and foremost, I want to thank our phenomenal keynote speaker, Professor Johanna Fernandez. If you have not already gotten a copy of her book, I definitely will push you out there to go get a copy of the book, and maybe I can convince her to start a book club, or we can start a book club and come in and dig deeper into the book. I also want to thank Ali, who was representing Housing for All, who works at Tenants and Neighbors. Andrea Shapiro is not with us, but we certainly thank her for participating. I want to thank you, Paige, for participating in this event and sharing the information that you did today. And of course, we want to thank our senator, our representative, our Harlem, trailblazer, who has been doing this work and has been texting, who has been protecting us throughout all of these years. Thank you so much, Senator Robert Jackson, for joining us today and telling us about the legislation and bills that you are putting forward to help address housing insecurity in New York City and Northern Manhattan. I want to thank all of our moderators today who did such a great job in leading our panel discussions. I want to thank the planning committee. Every Friday night, I sit down with the planning committee and we put together these dynamic programs for each and every one of you today. This cannot be done without the strength and leadership of our members. So thank you to the Membership Planning Committee for putting on yet another great meeting. I want to thank my co-workers, who many of you don't see the work that they're doing. Sometimes this work is invisible, but they are all hands on deck, making sure that this membership meeting is taking place. So I want to thank each and every one of you. I do have some upcoming information I want to share with you. regarding renewable RACAs, community conversation. We want you to come learn and show your support for the Renewable RACAs Act, which is a vision from the conversation among survivors of RACAs, criminal justice reform advocates, environmental justice advocates, and impacted community members. The vision is that the 413 acres of land on RACAs Island become a space for the solar farm to generate renewable energy in New York City, particularly for communities most impacted by the unjust criminal justice system and mass incarceration in our city. REACT is part of a coalition proposing the city pass 3 bills to make this idea a reality, which also helps to ensure the penal colony fully closes by 2025. As promised, the coalition is having a virtual public event next Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. for people to learn about the vision and show their support. Our Deputy Director, Cecil Corbin-Mark, will be on the panel. The more we can show community support, the more likely we are to turn it into a reality. I also want to let you know that we have our membership meetings coming up. The next membership meeting will be in September. We are going to be focusing on education. We also have our October membership meeting is going to be focusing on maternal mortality. And finally, our November meeting will be our annual meeting. So if you are not already a member of WEAC, we have a lot in store. It pays to be a WEAC member, so I urge you to go and sign up and become a WEAC member if you're not already. Thank you all so much for participating today, and I can't wait to see you at the next membership meeting. Have a blessed day. Enjoy your Saturday.
No announcements, Marquise?
Thank you, Marquise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No announcement?
Bye.
Did you have an announcement you can share? This is some
Yes. I just quickly want to add, guys, we are celebrating our 17th anniversary for Arts and Jazz Fest New York City. And we were supposed to debut on Governor's Island with jazz, but it has been postponed to next year. However, we are presenting 3 virtual events. Please tune in because Emmy Kemp is a longtime resident of Harlem. She's 85. She co-wrote the hit tune Bubbling Brown Sugar. And you could go to our website to find out the 3 great events. And it's artsandjazzfestny.com. Please join us August 23rd, 22nd, August 22nd, 23rd, and September 12th. So please join us.
Por favor, únanse a nosotros.
Yeah, I'm gonna put the web address in the chat.
Pongan la dirección en la cajita, en el chat. Pongan toda la información en el chat. Para que todos puedan verlo. Gracias.
I forgot. I'm excited. This was the first meeting that we have conducted in both
La primera reunión que la hemos conducido en inglés y en español.
And so, huge shout out to
un agradecimiento muy grande
translator,
a nuestros traductores, Vicente y Tomás.
Welcome, Vicente. I closed the translation room here and thanking you for such a phenomenal job today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to my colleague Tomás too, who was we were both on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomas. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great.
Thank you,
That's what you work on, she said.
Making this all possible.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, all the organizers.
Yeah. Thanks, Marquis, for all your hard work there.
Yes, Marquise.
Yeah,
Take care, Robert. Thank you, WEAC, for putting this on for everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Jackson, see you next time.
Yes, see you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Mr. Jackson, Tomás and I.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna, for all the great work today. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Johanna, Johanna, if you are still with us, I'd definitely love to connect with you. I think you might have lost her. All right.
Hi, Valerie. Valerie Joe Bradley.
Joanna needs to sign my book.
Hey, Freddie, Freddie Soto, good to be there at the meeting. Thank you for coming.
What up, Charles? I'm here. I'm listening still. Thanks for
Man,
everything.
good to hear you, Freddie.
Johanna, everybody.
Peggy, Charles.
Estamos aquí de este lado.
Hi, Valerie, Joe.
Thank you, thank you.
Hey, Charles, I'm gonna swing by. I gotta hit you up so we can link up or something.
Yeah, I'm in the office on Wednesdays. I'm on the office on Wednesdays.
Wednesdays, what time?
Before 1 o'clock.
Before?
From 11 to 1.
All right. I'll come see you.
Charles,
definitely.
save Queen Mother. Charles, save Queen Mother.
Hi, Queen Mother. How are you?
I'm out.
Everything is in divine order. I got my eviction notice. Y'all come and save me now.
Queen Mother, we'll swing by. We'll definitely do that.
Please swing by.
Definitely do that.
Yes,
Hey, Joe.
Dr. Blakely.